Like a lot of people grew up loving movies, and I actually ended up working for film studios, releasing some of the films that I absolutely love. And I now work at the largest cinema business in Australia. And the biggest thing that I have learned is just the remarkable impact that films actually have on who we are, how we behave, what we buy into, even what we believe. And some of that is really immediate and quick, and some of that impact is very long lasting. So when we think about big lifelong decisions for most of us, career and what we choose to pursue as a job is up there as one of the biggest. So back in 1993, the very first Jurassic Park was released, Spielberg. Now this was huge in a number of different ways. For me personally, this is the very first film that little 9-year-old Joe actually got to see at the cinema. It's very exciting. It also represented groundbreaking CGI that literally brought dinosaurs onto the big screen in a way that audiences at the time, back in the 90s, had never seen. And lastly, its two lead characters were paleontologists. They were the heroes of the film. Now, what that did was make dinosaurs really cool. It made paleontologists even cooler. And suddenly, a whole new generation of people wanting to pursue that as a career. More people studied it, there were more research papers, more grants were given. So one film, and arguably the whole franchise, has had a huge impact on the career that we would choose to pursue. And you can see a similar thing happening with Jaws and marine biology. Top Gun had a very similar increase in popularity around Navy and getting a chance to fly those planes. And so films have a huge impact on some of those lifelong decisions that we make. There's not much more long-lasting than our own names, or the names that we will choose to give our children. And no other company, period, has had the influence on baby names than Disney. Now, if you have had kids in the last 10 years, or you've had a little baby brother or a little sister, you'd have had to reckon with the force that is Frozen, which has gifted us a lot of bad karaoke, some really bad Halloween costumes, and pretty much a lifelong choice of Christmas and birthday presents in any merchandise that you can ever get your hands on. It also gave us a lot of babies named Elsa. And this is the impact that Disney can have, because pretty much every film that has a princess in it, you see a similar pattern with the popularity of that name. So think Belle, Moana, Ariel, Tiana, and obviously we have the animation and those releases, and then Disney, making the live action remakes, winning. So you might think that it's only the princesses or the good guys that you see on film. Everyone meet Damien? Damien looks very cute. For those of you that might not recognise this picture, Damien stars in The Omen, which the original came out back in 1976. And there's been a few series afterwards. But Damien in the film is the literal Antichrist. He is responsible for beheadings, murders, miscarriage. He's literally the opposite of what you would think anyone would want to name their baby after. And yet, Damien becomes popular right after the film releases. Go figure. There are a lot of examples of that actually happening. So, good or bad, films really influential in some of our biggest decisions. Nobody else knows that better than brands. So most of us are familiar with how brands show up in film through product placement. You'll see the brands and the products that we're used to every day on screen with the characters. Now, the most placed brand, period, in any movie is Apple. They're in the most movies that you will ever see. What I'm about to tell you is a little bit of a spoiler alert, and it might just change the way that you watch films, so you have been warned. Apple have something that is known as the no villain clause. So what that means is that you will never see a villain or a bad guy on screen with an iPhone. Yeah, so when you are watching a horror film or a whodunit or a murder mystery, the easiest way to tell or to spoil the plot twist is whoever does not have an iPhone. Because brands know the power of film. They know how influential it is. Apple does not want their products to be seen in a negative context or in a negative light. Because what we see on screen has a huge influence on what we end up buying. And there are so many different examples that I could talk to you about. Pretty much movies that had an impact on what we buy, the brands in every single category that you can think of. So think about what shoes you have on your feet right now, what jeans you're wearing, your sunglasses, your watch, what car you got here in. Every single one of those, at some point in time, will probably been influenced by what we see on screen and how they show up in movies. And sometimes that influence is pretty quick. So Barbie was released last year. Towards the end of the film, Barbie is entering the real world in her lovely pink Birkenstocks. On screen, that takes 46 seconds. 46 seconds is all it takes to trigger a huge surge in demand for pink Birkenstocks, and sales go through the roof. Obviously, with us on phones, we can provide that pretty immediately these days, but it just goes to show the immediate impact that films can have on what we buy and what we want to buy into. And they even influence what we choose to listen to. Now, growing up in the 90s and the 2000s, I've been through my fair share of boy bands and lip syncing. I thought I'd said bye 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 to NSYNC, but I had not. Thanks to Deadpool and Wolverine, which came out earlier this year, the opening credits of that film featured NSYNC's Bye Bye Bye. Now, this is a song that hadn't been in the charts for about 20 odd years, and all of a sudden, shot back up into the charts, huge increase in Spotify plays and YouTube views. And what it did was introduce a new generation to an old set of music, an old set of songs. And so in many ways, films have the power to turn back time. They can even predict the future. Now, there's a really interesting relationship between films and technology, and you see headlines everywhere these days talking about AI. Now, the first time AI actually shows up in movies is all the way back in 1927. It's a movie called The Metropolis. And in every decade since, there have been films that have had AI in them, whether it's part of the storyline or the character, The Day the Earth Stood Still, Terminator, even Star Wars with R2-D2 and C-3PO. So the relationship with films and technology is really interesting because it has a big impact on what ends up in our day-to-day life. Minority Report, released out in 2002, correctly predicted the technology that we have today. So in that film, you'll see things like 3D printing, biometric scanning, touchscreen, and real-time video conversations. All things we're very familiar with. Back then, didn't exist. Now, an interesting question is, did film predict that technology, or did it directly impact it and create it? Something that you might not know is that Steven Spielberg, who directed this film, gathered a group of scientists and futurists together, people from MIT, from DARPA, and he brought them together for an ideas summit. And he challenged them to come up with the next 50 years of technology, which they did, and that's what they saw in film. It only took about 12 years for all of that technology to become real and a part of our day-to-day life. So the imagination of directors and film has a huge impact in what actually shows up in our day-to-day culture. And keeping with the theme of future, then films also impact our future travel decisions. The most famous one is Lord of the Rings and what it did for travel to New Zealand. So when the first film came out, everybody obviously wanted to get a piece of the Hobbitons and the Lord of the Rings. And then there was a little bit of a drop-off until we got back into the second Hobbit series. But you can just see the huge impact that that series of films had on visitor numbers. And there are a lot of different examples across different film franchises and even TV series where we see this. It influences where we want to go and shows us new lands to visit. One single film can even change an entire sport. So in 2012, the number of girls participating in competitive archery doubled. Also what happened in 2012 was a little film called The Hunger Games that came out, starring Jennifer Lawrence as Katniss Everdeen. And 49% of those girls specifically said it was because of Katniss that they took up the sport. So a huge impact on what we do, what we choose to pursue, sports and hobbies. And from one female icon to another, can't talk about pop culture and movies without referencing Taylor. So obviously Taylor has just finished her pop cultural phenomenon Eras tour. Now for most of us that would have been something that we would have seen live in person at a stadium. But she also released the Eras tour, the movie, at cinemas. And so if you couldn't go there, this was a great way to actually experience that gig. Now, Swifties were not just sitting down in the cinema eating a bag of popcorn, they treated it like they were there at the live event. And also doing things like trading friendship bracelets. So fans and the connection that we have lives off screen as well as it lives on screen. We are joined by what we love to watch, and cinema and the content, the type of film that we create, reflects what we're interested in. Another really good example of that fandom is Minions. So Rise of Gru came out a few years ago, and this is a homegrown trend. There was a group of Aussie teens that decided for a bit of fun that they would show up to the cinema for the Rise of Gru dressed in suits. Now it's fun because the original Minions film was out about maybe like a decade ago, so they just barely kind of got into school and they thought it was a little bit of a fun thing to do. That then went global and it gave rise to what is known as the Gentle Minions. So fans connect with each other not just through the films that we see or the characters, but it can span different countries and different generations. And it's what makes cinema and film different. It just hits us differently. The act of going to the cinema, we have research on, actually shows that we have a much better relationship or a positive impact when we're going and seeing the films that we love. We're more positive, we are happier, we're more energised, and UCL have actually proven the direct relationship between what cinema has and those connections, even on creativity and things like productivity. Cinema just hits us different. So watching films, seeing them at the cinema can help with things like loneliness, it can help with our well-being, and there's a growing interest around using it for our mental health as well. So film therapy is something that a few studies are gaining traction around, and therapists are using film with their patients to help hard to talk about things emotionally. It's easier to talk about what you're going through the characters that you see on screen than it is yourself. And particularly for certain groups, people with autism, people with schizophrenia, they're using superheroes to be able to talk about those complex challenges. Film isn't just what you see on the screen. It also plays back what we're going through in real life. So there's never been as wide a range of films that we could choose to see. Depending on what country you're from, what culture you grew up in, how you identify, the challenges that you're going through, there is literally a film for you. And that's because not only does film and cinema shape who we are, it also reflects back what society is looking like. It's a bit like a cultural mirror. And that's where cinema and movies go beyond just being a form of entertainment. They're actually a force for good. Now, when you're opening a bit of news on your phone, especially, or kind of like on a TV news program, flicking through kind of doesn't hit you. When you're watching a film, and you're put into the head and you see what that character is going through. It could be an AIDS sufferer, it could be a victim, it could be an outsider. You see and you feel what they're going through and it hits you. And that's how social change happens. Movies have the power to start conversations, to change our minds and to create movements. And they've even got the power to change the law. Back in the 60s, the original Alfie film from the UK changed abortion laws over there. A Fantastic Woman changed gender identity laws in Chile. And A Girl in the River changed the long-standing laws around honour killings in Pakistan. So in her words, that is the power of film. Films and movies have an outsized impact on who we are, on how we show up, what we buy into. They're not just a way to pass the time. So the next time that you're watching a film, just think about the fact that you're not just sitting there relaxing. Whatever is on screen is influencing who you are and who you might well become. Because the end of a film is definitely not the end of its impact.